The Linux community is changing, and not everyone is happy about it. For decades, Linux has stood as the symbol of digital freedom, a rebellion against corporate control, a playground for hackers, developers, and idealists who believed software should be open, transparent, and shared. It was never just an operating system, it was a philosophy. It was late nights on IRC channels, mailing lists filled with passionate arguments, and a sense that you were part of something bigger than yourself. But as Linux grows, as it becomes more mainstream, more commercial, and more accessible, the culture around it is shifting. And that shift is creating tension between the old guard and the new wave of users and contributors. To understand why people are frustrated, you have to understand where Linux came from. In 1991, when Linus Torvalds announced his kernel on a Usenet group, he wasn't trying to build a corporate empire. He was building a tool for himself, something free and flexible. That spirit attracted people who valued control over convenience, people who enjoyed tinkering, compiling kernels, editing configuration files by hand, and understanding every layer of their system. Linux wasn't polished, and that was part of the charm. It demanded effort, and in return, it offered power. Over time, Linux grew beyond hobbyists. Distributions like Debian, Red Hat, Slackware, and later Ubuntu made it more accessible. Graphical interfaces improved. Installation became easier. Hardware support expanded. Slowly, Linux started appearing in places no one expected, on servers powering the internet, on Android smartphones, on embedded devices, in supercomputers. Success changed everything. When Linux became the backbone of the modern web, corporations took notice. And that's when the first cracks in the community's identity began to show. Corporate involvement brought resources, stability, and influence. Companies like IBM, Google, Intel, and Microsoft began contributing to the kernel. On one hand, this was a validation of open source. The biggest tech companies in the world were building on Linux and giving back to it. On the other hand, some community members felt uneasy. Linux was supposed to be the alternative to corporate dominance, not a tool used by corporations to strengthen their own ecosystems. The lines between rebellion and infrastructure started to blur. The introduction of corporate-backed initiatives, foundations, and governance structures formalized what was once informal. The Linux Foundation became a central body coordinating development and funding. Conferences grew larger, sponsorships more prominent, and job titles more official. What used to be volunteers hacking in their spare time became full-time engineers paid by major tech firms. For many, this professionalization was inevitable and necessary. For others, it felt like the community was losing its soul. Then there is the culture shift around accessibility and user experience. For years, Linux enthusiasts prided themselves on the steep learning curve. It was a badge of honor. If you could navigate the command line, fix your bootloader, and troubleshoot dependency conflicts, you belonged. But modern distributions are focused on being user-friendly. Ubuntu, Linux, Mint, Pop_OS, and others aim to welcome newcomers who may have never touched a terminal. This democratization is good for growth, but it challenges the identity of those who built their reputations on mastering complexity. Some longtime users complain that the community is becoming too focused on aesthetics and convenience. They argue that energy is being spent on themes, icons, and app stores instead of core stability and performance. They see projects adopting design philosophies inspired by Windows and Mac OS and worry that Linux is chasing trends instead of setting its own direction. The push for Flatpak, snap packages, and containerized apps has sparked debates about fragmentation, centralization, and control. Take the snap packaging system, for example. When Canonical introduced it, the goal was clear: simplify software distribution, reduce dependency issues, and create a universal format. But critics argued that Snap's centralized store gave too much control to a single company. They worried about performance overhead and loss of transparency. Similar debates emerged around Flatpak and AppImage. What was meant to simplify life for users became another battlefield for ideological disagreement. Another flashpoint is systemed. When systemed replaced traditional init systems in many major distributions, it ignited one of the most heated debates in Linux history. Supporters praised it for modernizing startup processes, improving performance, and unifying fragmented approaches. Critics accused it of being overly complex, bloated, and against the Unix philosophy of do one thing and do it well. entire distributions forked or formed in response. The argument wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. It was about what Linux should be. Social dynamics are shifting too. In the early days, communication happened on mailing lists and forums where bluntness was common and social norms were looser. As the community grew, so did awareness of diversity, inclusion, and codes of conduct. Projects began adopting formal guidelines to ensure respectful behavior. Some applauded this as necessary to make open source welcoming to underrepresented groups. Others saw it as censorship or an erosion of the raw, unfiltered culture that defined early Linux communities. The introduction of codes of conduct, including the one adopted by the Linux kernel project, was a turning point. Linus Torvalds himself stepped back temporarily to reflect on his communication style. For some, this was a positive evolution toward healthier collaboration. For others, it symbolized the end of an era. They felt that the rugged no-nonsense style that built Linux was being replaced by corporate HR policies. There's also the rise of Linux influencers, YouTubers, and social media personalities shaping the conversation. In the past, influence came from writing code, maintaining packages, or contributing documentation. Today, someone can have massive impact simply by reviewing distributions or commenting on community drama online. This has broadened awareness of Linux, but also introduced new forms of conflict. Controversies spread faster, opinions harden. Tribalism grows between fans of different distributions. Distribution wars are not new, but they have evolved. The rivalry between desktop environments like GNOME and KDE continues, but now it's amplified by social media. Fans of Arch Linux debate with Ubuntu users. Minimalists clash with those who prefer polished out-of-a-box experiences. The fragmentation that once symbolized freedom now sometimes feels like chaos to newcomers. Choice is empowering, but too much choice can be paralyzing. Gaming is another area where change is dramatic. For years, Linux gaming was a niche hobby requiring workarounds and compromises. With the advent of Proton and the Steam Deck, Linux gaming has become surprisingly viable. Valve's investment in Linux has brought thousands of new users, but even this success has sparked debate. Some worry that gaming-focused optimizations prioritize consumer appeal over core system integrity. Others argue that attracting gamers is exactly what Linux needs to gain broader desktop adoption. Hardware support has improved dramatically, yet challenges remain. When users encounter issues with drivers, especially for GPUs or Wi-Fi cards, frustration can turn into criticism of the entire ecosystem. Some blame manufacturers for not providing open drivers. Others blame the community for not making Linux more attractive to hardware vendors. As Linux becomes more mainstream, expectations rise. Users compare it directly to Windows and Mac OS, and patience for rough edges diminishes. The commercialization of open source more broadly is reshaping Linux culture. Companies build profitable services around open source projects, sometimes without contributing proportionally back. The debate around open core models, dual licensing, and monetization strategies is ongoing. Some see it as necessary for sustainability. Others fear it undermines the spirit of sharing that defined early Linux development. Cloud computing has shifted the center of gravity. Linux dominates servers and cloud infrastructure, but most of that usage is invisible to everyday users. The desktop, once the symbolic battleground against Windows, feels less central. For many developers, Linux is simply the default environment in the cloud. It's no longer rebellious, it's standard. This normalization changes how people relate to it. It's harder to rally around a cause when that cause has already won in many domains. Education and onboarding have changed too. New users often discover Linux through online tutorials, Reddit threads, or TikTok clips. Rather than mailing lists and IRC, the tone is different. The expectations are different. Instant answers are expected. Patience for reading documentation is lower. Some longtime community members feel overwhelmed by repetitive beginner questions, while newcomers sometimes perceive veterans as dismissive or elitist. There's also generational change. The pioneers who were active in the 1990s and early 2000s are aging. Younger contributors bring different priorities and cultural norms. They may care more about user experience, accessibility, and social impact. They may be less attached to legacy tools or traditions. Change is natural, but it can feel like loss to those who remember how things used to be. Security and privacy have become more central in the broader tech conversation. Linux has long been associated with security, but modern threats are more complex. Supply chain attacks, vulnerabilities in widely used libraries, and the realities of maintaining massive codebases challenge the idea that open source is inherently safer. The community must adapt to new risks, and that requires processes and structures that sometimes feel bureaucratic. Funding models are another source of tension. Many critical open-source maintainers work unpaid or underpaid, even as their code powers billion-dollar companies. Burnout is common. Some projects turn to sponsorships or foundations. Others experiment with crowdfunding. The romantic image of volunteer-driven development collides with the reality of sustainable maintenance. Meanwhile, Microsoft's relationship with Linux has undergone a transformation. Once seen as the primary adversary, Microsoft now contributes to the Linux kernel and offers Linux integration in Windows. Windows' subsystem for Linux blurs boundaries. Some celebrate this as proof that open source has won. Others remain skeptical, recalling past hostility and warning against complacency. As Linux expands into areas like IoT, automotive systems, and enterprise appliances, decisions are increasingly driven by industry needs rather than hobbyist preferences. Standards, certifications, and compliance matter more. This professionalization can make the ecosystem feel less personal, more corporate. The hacker ethos gives way to project management frameworks and strategic roadmaps. Despite all these tensions, it's important to recognize that change also brings opportunity. More diverse contributors mean richer perspectives. Better user experience means more people can benefit from Linux. Corporate investment means resources for large-scale improvements. The challenge is balancing growth with values. The discomfort many feel is partly nostalgia. It's natural to romanticize the early days of any movement. When a community is small, it feels intimate. When it grows, it inevitably changes. The Linux community is no longer a fringe group of enthusiasts. It is a global ecosystem touching nearly every aspect of technology. With that scale comes complexity. At its core, the debate is about identity. Is Linux primarily a technical platform, a social movement, a business foundation, or a personal hobby? The answer is all of the above, but different people prioritize different aspects. When those priorities clash, conflict arises. Some fear that in the pursuit of mainstream acceptance, Linux will lose what made it special. Others argue that clinging to the past would make it irrelevant. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The community must evolve while preserving core principles of openness, collaboration, and user freedom. Open source has always been messy. Disagreements, forks, and debates are part of its DNA. The fact that people care enough to argue passionately is a sign of vitality. A stagnant community would be far more concerning. As new technologies emerge, from artificial intelligence to edge computing, Linux will continue to adapt. The community will continue to argue. Not everyone will be happy, but perhaps that's the point. Linux was never about uniformity. It was about choice. In the end, the Linux community is changing because the world around it is changing. Technology is more interconnected, more commercial, and more visible than ever. Linux sits at the center of that web. The question is not whether change will happen, but how the community navigates it. For longtime users, the challenge is to mentor rather than gatekeep, to share knowledge without condescension, to remember what it felt like to be new. For newcomers, the challenge is to respect the history and effort that built the tools they now enjoy. For corporations, the challenge is to contribute responsibly and transparently. For maintainers, the challenge is to sustain projects without burning out. No community remains static. The Linux community of today is not the same as it was 20 years ago, and it will not be the same 20 years from now. Some will drift away feeling that the magic is gone. Others will join, discovering their own version of that magic. The dissatisfaction voiced by some members is not necessarily a sign of decline. It may simply reflect growing pains. When ideals meet reality at scale, friction is inevitable. What matters is whether the core commitment to openness and collaboration endures. The Linux community is changing, and not everyone is happy. But perhaps the more important question is whether happiness was ever the goal. Linux was built on curiosity, stubbornness, experimentation, and debate. Those traits are still present. They just manifest differently now. As long as people can access the source code, fork projects, propose changes, and build new distributions, the spirit of Linux remains alive. It may look different. It may sound different. It may feel less like a small club and more like a vast city. But it is still shaped by those who participate. Change can feel like loss, especially when it challenges identity. Yet it also opens doors. The Linux community stands at a crossroads between nostalgia and progress. The path forward will not satisfy everyone. It never has. And maybe that enduring tension is the most authentic thing about it.